Have you ever stood alone in your decision or in a decision that you've made at any of the organizations that you've worked at? And how has this hurt or helped your organization when you went forward with that decision?
Yes.
When you own your own company, it's always yes.
Well, when you're at the top, it is lonely. So you are alone. And usually the questions that you get are the ones that no one else wants to answer. And so you have to be prepared to make a decision and stand by it alone. And my predecessor as the head of our company was very good at that, and he and I would disagree on things, but he made his decision and stood by it, and I learned a very fine lesson from him. And that is that if it's better to be right than to be popular, and sometimes to be right is very difficult, and you're going to be alone, but time will prove you right.
I think a lot of times I find out that I am wrong, actually. You may think you're right, especially when you start off something. I've basically did a lot of startups, but what I've done is I think I've been able to learn from the people who I worked with. So while you start off with a firm conviction and a vision that you're right, you still have to be open to the feedback of people who are a ton smarter than you. There's always more knowledge out there than in my head. So yeah, you may start off with a vision, with conviction, but there's a whole lot of learning that goes on. And I think you mentioned the humility of being able to admit that you're totally wrong, but the vision may still be right. And then you've got to make adjustments along the way.
It occurs to me that it's what happens after that lonely decision that's the real hard part. It has been in my experience, and that is when you are second-guessed. And the challenging part there, I found, is to allow people to second-guess you without challenging that. Let people say their piece. Let people doubt, and let the outcomes speak for you. It's very, very difficult not to try to quash opposition. I think it's important to let people have their say, but in the end, don't second guess yourself.
The essence of leadership is making decisions. You make them all the time. And of course, we all have made decisions that no one else agreed with, and nobody didn't even know there was a question that we made the decision about, because the job of a leader is making decisions. So depending on the circumstances, you're going to be by yourself, and you're going to put yourself in circumstances which may not be where you want to be. But I really want to emphasize that if the leader doesn't make quick, clear decisions, good or bad, they aren't doing their job. That the organization, and particularly a large, complex organization, really depends on the leadership making quick decisions. I've had a lot of conversations about that in a multiple set of kinds of institutions. So yeah, you find yourself making decisions. Sometimes they prove to be right. You always, when you make you don't deliberately take a wrong decision, but you're always working on insufficient information. Because the information, generally the information that comes into your office is biased. Because whoever has produced it because they want a certain kind of decision. And most decision makers have an instinct, and they also have a knowledge base which is independent of the input that you're coming into the office. So you make a decision and you run with it. And then you find out afterwards, one, whether it was a good decision or a bad decision, or two, whether it holds. It could be a good decision that doesn't work anyway. It can be a bad decision. And I think maintaining flexibility is what leadership does. You have to continue to move on. If you start worrying about the mistake you made a week ago or a day ago, I mean, I could tell you decisions I took today that have significant risk attached to them, and I will kind of monitor to see how they evolve over time. But my whole staff depends on me doing that. And if I don't do it, the institution basically grinds to a halt and is very unproductive.
Thank you.
I think that's probably the most fun part about being a leader is you get to make decisions, and then you get to make a redecision the next day, and another, and then that was a great, or the idea is that that's when you listen to what's out there, and then it becomes your idea, or you modify it, but you're right, the beauty of leadership is the ability to make decisions, and be right, be wrong, and then make, new decisions or redecisions.
This week, one of our readings discussed not just the decision-making process, but how do you handle the consequences of the decision if it is a negative consequence. So our students would like a real-life example, if you have one, of a time when you've had to manage the consequences of your decision. And what were those?
Since I was last, I'll go first this time. You have to fix it. The basic bottom line, if it's a mistake, you got to do something about it. So I'll take an example. President of Reed College, institution was in serious shape. We fixed that. Within 3 years, the institution was flying. There was a level of confidence that hadn't existed before, and we began to think about reaching, doing things we'd never done before, and I had an idea. It was a good idea. It was to provide daycare for the faculty and the staff, because as you probably can tell from my background, I'm quite sensitive to these kinds of issues. So I established a committee of faculty and staff to examine and develop a program for daycare for staff and faculty at Reed. My chief financial officer, who was a superb chief financial officer and who said no 99% of the time, told me this was a stupid idea. And I told him to get on with it. So 6 months later, they started issuing a series of reports. And it became very clear to me that he was right and I was wrong. It was a really dumb idea. Dumb for financial reasons and for reasons of equity. And equity was a big value in the Reed culture. Staff simply couldn't afford the kind of daycare that we were going to offer, except the senior staff. So recognizing this, I ended the responsibilities of the first committee, and I appointed a second committee to examine the financial aspects of the proposals, and I made the chief financial officer chair. They never had a meeting. It was clear. I killed the whole issue right there and then. So you have to decide what's going on, and you have to make, as my colleague said, you have to continue to make decisions. And I don't think you can get hung up. People would needle me later on, Steve, you didn't deliver on the child care. And I said, you're right, I didn't. It wasn't feasible. Can we have another conversation?
Thank you.
Yeah, you may have picked up from Dr. Brophy's introduction that I work for a software company called Esri. So when I had to deal with the consequence of a decision was way back in the late 90s when I was responsible for standing up the Penn State online program. We started from nothing. And I made a really bold strategic decision at that time, and that was to go with the software created by Esri's competitor. And that was not a smart business decision as it played out over the months. And as Steve said, he had to fix it. So we phased in an Esri track to our program, and then eventually, as our enrollments grew and grew and grew, we dedicated ourselves to Esri. And I'm still trying to make that up to my boss.
Well, when I was the head of our company, we made an acquisition, and it turned out to be a very poor acquisition. I knew the CEO of the company we were acquiring, and I believed what he was saying, and that was a mistake. it turned out after a few weeks, we realized that it was a mistake. And when you're in a publicly held arena, that gets very complicated. So there were a lot of disclosure issues, there were a lot of negotiations, there were a lot of lawyers. But the fact was we had made a mistake and relied on representations that we should have dug a little deeper ourselves and found out what the real facts were. So what do you do about that? Well, we got out of it at a minimum cost, but that was the first part. The second and third part, I think, were the important ones. We treated it as a mistake with complete transparency. You know, the worst thing is the cover-up, and we avoided completely any cover-up. And the last thing that we did, which two of my people that worked for me suggested, and they were absolutely right, was let's sit down and have some discussions. What did we learn from this? And we learned a lot. We learned how to do due diligence in a very, very significant way, and an improvement over what we had done previously, so that we would not make that same mistake again.
I spent 16 years, one of the careers, 16 years in investment real estate, and some of the mistakes you make, the consequences are just horrendous. I was involved in 2 recessions, and at times you make some investment decisions, and it just changes people's lives, and you just can't undo that. As you get older, you just kind of thicken your skin and have to live with some of that stuff, and so there's just some consequences you can't undo. And part of being a leader is just you have to move on and live with that, and go on and make other decisions.
Richard spoke a bit about ethics, and our students were wondering, have your personal morals or ethics ever been compromised in your leadership role, and how so?
I think, that's a day-to-day stuff. I can go from big investments to trying to fix somebody's car, and you're sitting there and they have X amount of money and they need a lot more work than they can afford, and you've got to decide how do you make that balance? I mean, how do you make it work? They've got X amount of money, it takes X times 2 to make the car the way it should be, but reality sets in and they can't afford for what should be, so now they still got to get to work or they got to get to school. And I don't think any of us ever really, your morals, your north doesn't change, but then you've got to make practical decisions that come up against that. And reality is reality. No matter how much you try to bend it, there's that gray area of making decisions the best you can.
Well, I think those 2 tests that I mentioned to you about ethics, I mentioned had stood me in good standing throughout my career, and certainly expediency and easy decisions lurk at every turn almost every day, and you just have to steel yourself and avoid getting into things that are unethical. Sometimes it can be very expensive for your shareholders, and yet you're doing the right thing if you're doing the ethical thing. An example, we were doing some business overseas where other governments, other companies don't have the same ethical standards we do, and wanted money for this, that, and the other thing, and we simply wouldn't do it. I think you got to really take the high road on ethics, and sometimes it costs you in the near term, but you sure can sleep at night.
During my academic career, I had the great good fortune to work with some ethicists about the ethical implications of geospatial technologies, the field that I work within. And that was marvelously enlightening to work with experts, philosophers who specialized in ethics. And a fellow named Michael Davis, who is really a pretty outstanding scholar of ethics in the professions, has gone so far as to say that the very definition of a profession, as opposed to just an occupation, that the definition of a profession has much to do with whether or not that field of practice has distinctive ethical problems that are unique to its field of practice. And that's certainly the case with geospatial issues of geographic profiling, issues of privacy, issues of geospatial intelligence, and the use of geospatial technologies in war, all raise very profound ethical issues, and those are certainly things I've confronted in the past, and I've tried to make the students that I worked with as an educator aware not only of those issues, but aware of the tests that you use to determine whether the course of action that might seem right to you is in fact one you'll feel good about later.
I also think ethics, one's own personal ethics, are very critical to what one does. And it's also critical to be as explicit as you can about your ethics, because it turns out that ethics are personal and then they're cultural. And it's very easy to confuse that. But having said that, it's still a very slippery slope. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of issues that I thought were ethical that I took a particular position on, but they weren't necessarily in the best interests of the institution that I was serving. So when I was president of Reed, we had a sexual harassment case. It was a case between 2 males who were both gay and in the same department. And without going through the whole bloody circus, there was no harassment as I understood the term. And both stories were exactly the same. So there was no issue in my mind that there had been no harassment. But the Oregon law on sexual harassment means that if the person who was presumed to be the person being harassed, the definition of what was harassment was in the mind of the person who was harassed. It didn't have to happen. The law just was written that way. So legally, it was harassment. And because it was done between 2 consenting adults, my insurance agency at the college said, you have no reason to defend the faculty member who was accused of harassment. And by the way, the faculty grievance procedure, in fact, found him guilty of harassing, even though the faculty also shared my view. So I could have walked away from my faculty member because he was exposed legally, not the institution. But I felt that was irresponsible and immoral. And so I insisted that the insurance company, which they didn't want to do, defend my faculty member, which of course in real terms meant that they were going to settle outside of court, which they did, and our insurance premiums went up. So there's one example. A second example was rather recently at the Huntington. I sit on the investment committee. And I've been sitting on investment committees for 20 years, but I don't know anything. So I keep my mouth shut. But they were discussing an investment that I really didn't like. And it came from Cambridge & Associates, which is the primary consultant for most nonprofits in this country. I don't know whether Marymount uses them. And it was an investment to participate in a mutual fund that was buying and selling developing country currencies. Now, I don't know whether it was a good investment or not. I had no ability to judge that. But I'm a specialist on international politics. And what I do know is that when wealthy countries begin to invest and speculate in developing country currencies, it plays havoc with the ability of the developing country to have a stable economy, because their currency is being driven up and down by so-called market forces and speculating in currency. So I went to my office and I wrote an essay to the investment committee arguing that the recommendation from Cambridge was not immoral, but amoral. And in that context, it was wrong. Well, my board member, who was chairman of the investment committee, was really angry at me because I didn't talk with him first. My chief financial officer was also angry at me because I hadn't talked with her about how to handle her chairman of this committee. But I stuck by my guns and I defended my position in the investment committee and was outvoted 7-0. Now, didn't bother me. I wanted to make the point. I wasn't upset with the vote because different people have see different issues in different ethnic contexts, you know? And I think that's also part of being a leader. You can't be afraid sometime to say, this is what I think, even though this was not a surprise, by the way, because our advisor was predicting a 10 to 15% return on this investment. This was last year. By the way, it lost money and we got out of it in less than a year, but that's beside the point. So, and I've now forgotten the third example, but I really think you have to recognize that your ethics are important so that you can sleep at night and tell your kids that this is, you know, what mommy or daddy does.
Did any of you have a single opportunity over the course of your life that allowed you to emerge as a leader? A moment where you really saw yourself shine and said, oh, that was it. That's the moment when I entered into this leadership capacity.
There was a moment when I decided early in my career that while I thought highly of and was enjoying the legal profession, that I really wanted to be a manager responsible and accountable rather than an advisor. And I'm delighted I made that decision. Although it wasn't easy, I found the fit that made more sense for me.
I was really lucky. I grew up in an unbelievable household. My uncle was a professional athlete, and I was. My dad was an investment and a manager for these athletes. It was a thoroughbred racing business in the 60s and 70s, and it was just an amazing experience to be around. You know, those days. I'm sure I don't want to date everybody, but in those days the Triple Crown was unbelievable. The Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont were like the Super Bowl. And I was just fortunate to be around jockeys or thoroughbred jockeys who won those races, and to watch that fine line between, you know, these small men who were winning the Kentucky Derby, the Belmont, the Preakness. My uncle was fortunate enough to win also those races. To see a shoemaker, a hardtack, versus the same guy, the same look, sweeping out the stables. So that you see that, and it just, I mean, it was the most unbelievable. I mean, I was a young kid. My dad would go down, we'd be in the stable area early in the morning, and to kind of just feel that, and I couldn't articulate it, but that difference between, you know, Willie Hardtack or Shoemaker or Longden, or my uncle was pretty good, and the guys who just couldn't put that together was just inexplicable, something magical, but you could just see it. So, I mean, at a very early age, I just, you know, I don't know, and not that I thought myself as a leader, but I could just see that and try to understand that.
Thank you. Another question from our audience is, as leaders, how do you make hiring decisions? What traits do you look for in your employees?
Character matters. I think that's really the most important thing when you're hiring. It's 24/7. They represent everybody who works for your company, who works with you. So number one is character matters. And then you have, I think the good point of trying to find the right fit is essential, because that'll make everyone, and that's what works. So you put the wrong person in the wrong position, or the right person in the wrong position just makes for an ugly relationship. But character matters. You have to first hire for character.
I've learned since I've been in my current position a particular technique in determining a prospective employee's fit, and that is to insist on them telling anecdotes about their past their past performance given a particular situation, much as we've been called upon to do this evening.
Well, the job I've had for the last 20 years has been CEO and COO. So the people I'm going to directly hire are basically vice presidents. They're going to hire everybody else. There are 400 full-time paid employees at the Huntington. So I've got a very small group of 12 people that I'm basically responsible for hiring and firing and for supervising them. I have prejudices about this, and I try to be fairly explicit with both my senior staff as well as with candidates. So most of the time I'm looking for what I think of as raw talent. The intelligence, their creativity, their hard work, and their ability to think in non-traditional ways. I like all of that. So I have a prejudice, and I mean it that way. I'm looking for that. On the other hand, I'm a team captain, and I've got to have the team functioning at its highest level. So I've got to have someone that fits, because if they don't fit, they can be as creative as all get out, but they're going to be pretty useless because the other members of the team will find ways to undermine their effectiveness because they rub the wrong way. So in the most recent search, which we're about to announce the result of, probably the best of the candidates in terms of my prejudice is not going to get the job, because in the interview process, which was an elongated interview process where I could watch the candidate interacting with my senior staff, he clearly was upsetting some people. Also my board that was involved in the interview process. So no matter how talented he was, and it was very interesting because they couldn't explain why. It wasn't obvious. It was very, very interesting. It was subtle, but it was there. And I chose to eliminate the candidate because clearly something was going on. I couldn't explain it, and neither could they, but it was going on. And that's a kind of reality check. And so we're going with candidate B, who didn't have quite the same kinds of responses, but also has great skills, but not exactly matched with the job. So we'll see exactly what happens over time. I think that's the other part of leadership. You've got to take risks and deal with them as you go along.
Listening to these gentlemen, I realize that we all have worked very hard at hiring people, and we have done our very best to be objective and to use all the appropriate standards in interviewing, and I've done that. And I must say, over the years, when I've done it well, I'm right about 60% of the time. And therefore, the lesson from that, for me, is you've got to learn to live with your mistakes. You've got to give the person who is not fulfilling what your expectations, you got to give them clear feedback early and give them a good chance. But if you've made a mistake, you've made a mistake and you've got to correct it. And I hate it. That's the worst part of the job, letting somebody go that you hired that you shouldn't have hired. But I'll be darned if I know how anybody can be right 90% of the time, except my wife, of course.
So when I was in the corporate world, we hired McKinsey, which is a great consulting firm, to analyze the top salespeople. So the idea was that if we could figure out what characteristics or attributes were the top salespeople, then we could just hire those type of people. So I like to, needle everybody who's spending a lot of money and improving stuff. So my position was, before we hired McKinsey, we were right only 20% of the time. After hiring McKinsey, we were wrong 80% of the time.
Would you each just perhaps some parting advice for students who are studying leadership on things they should consider as they study in this discipline?
I hope you're a good listener, because I can guarantee you the four of us are, because you can't be a leader unless you can listen well. And I think there's lots of wisdom that you've heard, but for me, The most important thing is to realize that you have to be yourself, you have to be honest, presuming that's part of who you are, but also you have to be ready to be wrong. If you are the kind of person who worries about a bad decision you take, and we all take bad decisions, that's human. 60% right in hiring, that's a great batting average. That's a hell of a lot higher than Ted Williams, who was the last batter to bat over 400. So a lot of it relates to perspective. But as a leader, you just have to be ready to be wrong, to make mistakes, and your responsibility is to fix them, to be honest about fixing them, and move on. If you can do that, I think you can be a very effective leader. But if you always want to be right, and you don't ever want to admit you're wrong, you can either run for president or not be a leader.
As I looked over your syllabus, I was pleased to see that that you are considering service leadership. I don't know if I forget what the date was. Have you already got to that? That's coming up soon. And I think one important lesson of that is that leadership is an opportunity available to all of us at the local level, if not at the national level. Leadership is essentially service, right? Service to an organization, service to a community, service to one another. And I think that the thing that binds all that together as leadership, if it came down to one word, it's come up repeatedly this evening, it is listening well, and translating that into strategic action.
I think the advice that's been given is spot on, so I don't have a lot to add to that. Except I said earlier, there's always been a question, is leadership innate or is it learned skill? And I think a lot of people have the innate ability who don't make good leaders. And I think a lot of people who don't think they have any innate ability learn and work hard, and certainly hard work is the common denominator of success, turn out to be very fine leaders. And as you can tell from the four of us, there's all sorts of different styles of leadership. So it doesn't matter exactly what your style is. It's whether you have the characteristics that my colleagues have talked about.
I think there's a big difference between being a great doer and a great leader. To be a great leader, I think you really have to really take tremendous amount of pleasure in the accomplishments of others. And if you don't really love and enjoy just seeing other people succeed, then you can be a great doer, but I don't think you'll be a great leader.